So this page discusses data from the 2016 primary, right?
That's right.
And there was a voter ID law in place during that 2016 primary election, right?
Yes.
And that's the HB 589 or VIVA law.
That's right.
So looking at this page 24506, it states that 1,048 voters completed a declaration of reasonable impediment during that 2016 primary, right?
Stating that they had circumstance, a reasonable impediment that prevented them from obtaining ID for the purpose of voting.
And in some circumstances, if a voter filled out a reasonable impediment declaration, their vote might count, notwithstanding the fact they did not present ID. Is that right? That's
correct. Yes, by completing that declaration, then that allowed them to have a ballot and proceed with voting.
So the slide goes on to say that of those 1,048 voters who completed the declaration of reasonable impediment in the 2016 primary, that 864 votes were ultimately counted, correct?
Yes, that's what the slide states. Yes.
And so the remainder, which the difference between the 1,048 and 864, were not ultimately counted. Is that fair?
Yes, that would be fair.
Did anyone from the state legislature ask the state board to study the racial demographics of voters who completed declarations of reasonable impediment in the 2016 primary?
I do not know
that. Do you know whether anyone from the state legislature asked the state board to study the racial demographics of the 864 voters who were ultimately counted?
I do not know that either.
We can turn to the next page. This is 24507. And this is also reviewing the 2016 primary data, correct?
Yes, it is.
And this slide states that 1,248 voters did not have their votes count because they did not present acceptable photo identification or execute a declaration of reasonable impediment or return to the county office at a deadline after election night. Is that right?
Yes, that's what it states.
Do you know whether anyone from the state legislature asked the state board to conduct any analysis of the racial demographics of these 1,248 voters?
I do not know.
Does the slide deck we've been looking at contain any data on racial demographics in any regard?
Let me confirm. I can't.
Take your time.
A lot of presentations, so let me confirm.
Yes, take your time.
I do not see anything that pertains to racial demographics in this presentation.
We discussed for a second the possibility of the state legislature asking the state board to conduct analyses of racial demographics. If such a request were to be made, who at the state board is likely to receive that request?
Are you asking during this time period of this presentation or what our processes would be now?
At the time period of the presentation. Thank you for clarifying.
I believe at that point in time, it would have been through general counsel and the public information officer at the time, and then they would work with there were and are data analysts on our staff that are part of our database administration and therefore work with the chief information officer as well.
So again, just confining ourselves to the period before December 19th, 2018. Are you aware of any communications other than what we just discussed between the state board and the state legislature about any effect that SB 824 might have on voter turnout?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Do you know whether, again, during this time period before December 19th, 2018, the state board provided any member of the state legislature, their staff, with any analysis of the potential impact of SB 24 on voter turnout?
I'm not aware of an analysis of that.
Are you, and you're not aware of any specific other organization that did this analysis?
Yeah, was just clarifying.
Possibility.
The analysis was not done by the State Board of Elections that I'm aware of.
Understood. Again, before December 19th, 2018, are you aware of any communications between anyone from the state board and any member of the state legislature or their staff about any effect that SB 824 might have on turnout by party affiliation?
I am not aware of such.
And just to clarify, did the state board undertake any analysis of the potential impact of SB 824 on voter turnout by party affiliation before December 19th, 2018?
I do not know of such analysis by the state board.
Are you aware of any communications before December 19th, 2018 between anyone from the state board and any member of the state legislature or their staff about any effect that SB 824 might have on voter fraud?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Do you know whether the state board did any analysis of the potential impact that SB 824 might have on voter fraud, again, before December 2018?
I'm not aware of such analysis by the state board.
Are you aware of any communications between anyone from the state board and any member of the state legislature or their staff before December 19th, 2018 about any effect that SB 824 might have on voters on account of race, color, or ethnicity?
I am not aware.
And did the state board conduct any analysis of any potential racial impact of SB 824 before December 19th, 2018?
I'm not aware of any analysis of that nature by the state board.
Are you aware of any communications between anyone from the state board and anyone from the General Assembly or their staffers about how or whether or not the impact of SB 824 might differ from the impact of HB 589?
I'm not aware of that, no.
And did the state board conduct any analysis of the possible difference, if any, between HB 589, SB 824 before December 19th, 2018?
No, I don't think there was any analysis of that nature done.
Are you aware of any communications between anyone from the state board and anyone from the legislature before December 19th, 2018 about the potential impact, if any, of including student and employee IDs as acceptable IDs for voting?
No.
Do you know that the state board conducted any analysis before December 19th, 2018 of any potential impact of including student and employee IDs as acceptable IDs for voting?
No, I'm not aware.
I want to turn now to HB 589 or the VIVA law.
Okay.
So as we discussed, HB 589 was a predecessor to SB 824, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And HB 589 was ultimately struck down by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Is that right?
That's my understanding or recollection, yes.
So is it correct that HB 589 was only in force during the March 2016 primary?
That's correct. That was the only time it was used in an election.
So we're going to turn now to some of the analyses that the state board undertook during the time that HB 589 was under consideration after it was enacted. So for the record, this is Holmes SBOE POD 025867. Do you know what this document is?
Yes, I have seen this document.
What is it?
It's an analysis in 2013. Basically, the a comparison of the DMV records to the voter registration records, of trying to determine the number of individuals who might not have a DMV ID that could be used for voting purposes.
Do you happen to know when HB 589 was introduced?
I'm trying to recall. I believe it was part of the 2014 legislative session. So I don't remember the exact date. I may be off on that.
So these tables on page 9 show demographic information on voters for whom the state board could not identify a DMV ID match. Is that right?
That is correct.
It's my understanding, and tell me if this is wrong, it's my understanding that when the heading says voters for whom the State Board of Elections could not identify an NC-DMV ID match, what that means is this is a set of registered North Carolina voters who are not showing up in the DMV system as holding a DMV issued ID.
That's right, based upon the criteria or the filters that were used. Yes.
Do you happen to know what criteria or filters were used in generating this particular report?
I believe it's elsewhere in this document. Maybe confusing that with, yes, there's actually a matching criteria on 025872 of this document.
And do you have any reason to believe that there are matching criteria listed here that should not have been included, or others that are missing that should have been included?
I think the answer would be that, to my knowledge, this would be the criteria that was requested in order to generate the no match list. As I mean, it's indicated that it was a request that was made. There could be issues with any data search. Name misspellings or something of that nature is why I often hesitate to say that it might not be an inclusive list or a comprehensive list.
But you're not aware of any specific problem that strikes out to you?
No, not that stands out to me, no.
Returning back to page 9, the last page in the document, if you look at the top chart, this is, you see in the second set of the chart, numbers of voters broken down by race. Is that right?
That's correct.
And there are 107,681 Black voters for whom the state board did not identify a DMV ID match. Is that right?
I'm sorry, what number did you state?
107,681.
Yes, that's what it indicates.
If you go down just a little ways, it indicates that there were 172,613 white voters for whom there was not a DMV ID match. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, of registered voters.
Do you know whether the state board did any analysis to determine whether these numbers were proportional to the relative numbers of Black and white voters in North Carolina at the time?
I don't believe that that's within this analysis.
Do you know if the state board did any other analysis to determine whether those numbers are proportional to the racial demographics of registered voters in North Carolina?
I'm not aware of an analysis of that.
Do you know that the state board undertook an analysis similar to the one we see before us on this chart that shows the racial breakdown of voters on the no match list before SB 824 was passed?
Before SB 824, there was another analysis done after this one, but believe that was still pertaining to the Viva bill. So I don't believe, no, I'm not aware of one being done for 584 or 90, whatever, the newer bill.
Taylor, can you pull up tab 3, please? We'll mark it as Exhibit 10. For the record, this is Holmes SBOE POD 25876. Ms. Ballot, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
Is this the more recent analysis you were just mentioning?
Yes, this was the second analysis, but that still pertained to the Viva bill.
And this was also publicly available, correct?
That's correct.
And this analysis updates the analysis we just looked at, correct, as of November 2014?
Yes, that's correct.
Can we go to pages 9 and 10, please? Or I guess 10 and 11, I'm sorry. So these tables also show demographic information for voters for whom the State Board of Elections could not identify a DMV ID match. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So if we can look at the right-hand column, that shows the voters who voted at least once, correct?
That's right, yes.
Looking on page 10, the number of Black voters who voted at least once were on this no match list is 60,690. Is that right?
That's what it indicates, yes.
And then the number of white voters, I think this is on the next page, who voted at least once who were on the no match list is 95,566. Is that right?
Yes, that's what it indicates.
Do you know that the state board did any analysis to determine whether these numbers were proportional to the relative number of Black and white registered voters in North Carolina at the time?
I don't know whether an analysis of that nature was done.
Do you have any reason to believe that the racial demographic breakdown of North Carolina voters on the no match list changed meaningfully between November 2014 and December 2018?
I don't know specifically to that without doing an analysis.
And no such analysis has been done by the state board, to your knowledge. Is that right?
To my knowledge, that's not been done.
Would the state board have had the ability to undertake that sort of analysis in December 2018?
By ability, do you mean individuals with skill set or resources to do so, or?
Let me rephrase that. So if in December 2018, the General Assembly or some staffer for the General Assembly had come to the state board and handed the state board these two documents we just looked at and said, can you please conduct an analysis like this? It's updated to the current day. Would the state board have been able to fulfill that request?
Yes, I mean, it's data that is available that could be analyzed between the two, DMV and the state registration list.
Are you familiar with HB 1169?
Yes.
And that was enacted this past June, correct?
That's correct.
So section 10 is amending, GS 163-166.16a to include an identification card issued by a department, agency, or entity of the United States government or the state for government program of public assistance, correct?
Yes, that's what it reads.
And so those sorts of ID cards, public assistance IDs, will count as acceptable forms of photo ID for voting under this amendment. Is that right?
Yes, that's what the amendment would do. Yes.
This is Exhibit 12, and the Bates number is Holmes SBOE POD 082824. Ms. Bell, this is email correspondence from June 2020, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And this is about some talking points in response to some questions about HB 1169. Is that right?
Well, they're questions from NC Policy Watch that that do pertain to HB 1169.
And the questions are asked of the state board. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
I wanted to turn your attention to the second page, the third bullet. And am I reading this correctly that the black text is the questions from Policy Watch and the red and blue text are the proposed responses from the state board?
Yes, that should be correct.
Okay. So if you look at the third bullet, it says the question is another controversial aspect of HB 1169. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So I'm looking at the blue, which is the proposed response, and it says, although the photo ID law is currently enjoined by state and federal courts, we are supportive of the change to allow public assistance IDs, as it would increase the types of photo IDs that would be acceptable if the law were not joined. Do you see that?
Yes.
I assume that the last word is a typo and it meant we're not enjoined. Does that seem fair?
That seems fair. I noticed that.
So based on this response, how would Section 10 of HB 1169 increase the types of photo IDs that would be acceptable if the voter ID law were not enjoined?
So this amendment in 1169 was adding additional photo ID options.
Can you name some examples of photo IDs that would be covered under Section 10 of HB 1169, but were not otherwise part of the voter ID law before that was passed?
Are you saying what IDs are in 1169 over 824? Or
so what I'm trying to get at is whether or not, if you can give me some examples of sorts of public assistance IDs that are covered by HB 1169 Section 10, like a specific example of a particular ID.
There's a different. So we've done a little bit of inquiry on this, but because of the injunction, we've not done any particular. We've not delved into this a great deal, so I'm not sure that would be more specific than public assistance IDs.
I'm not sure. I assume it's not been a top priority with the COVID and the general election. Whether this has been enjoined.
Right. We focused on what needed to be done for this election. Yes.
So just to clarify, the state board didn't undertake any analysis to figure out which IDs would be covered by Section 10 of HB 1169 before answering this question in the email exchange. Is that right?
I'd have to compare the time frame, but our general counsel, Caitlin Love, did make an inquiry just to determine if there was an element to this part that would have required us to do any SIEMs, our state information or election information management system changes. But that's about as far as we've gotten.
So the state board also didn't undertake any analysis to determine the racial demographics of voters who hold IDs that fall under Section 10 of HB 1169. Is that right?
Correct. We have not done any analysis of this section of 1169.
Do you know whether the state legislature asked the state board to undertake any analysis of Section 10 of H 1169 before it was enacted?
I am not aware of any request.
This is Exhibit 13, and the Bates number is Holmes SBOE POG 083010. Do you see it?
Yes, I do.
And this is an email exchange from June 2020 among members of the state board. Is that right?
Of the state board staff.
Members of the state board, yes. Thank you. And this is an email a few days after the one we were just talking about, right?
That's correct.
I wanted to direct you to the second email on the first page, so with the 9:47 a.m. timestamp.
Yes.
At the end of that email, you wrote, public assistance IDs, we're actually going to need to research if these IDs have photos. Caitlin is reaching out to find out more. You see that?
Yes.
So just to clarify, is it fair to say that at the time that the previous emails were sent that we just looked at in the previous exhibit, the state board had not yet done that research to determine if the IDs had photographs?
Yes, that's correct. I'm not sure where we were in terms of correspondence or hearing back from others, but at that point in time, it was not confirmed.
And just to be clear, a public assistance ID only qualifies for voting if it has a photograph. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, I believe that's how it was written. It's a photo ID law. So
if you can look at the next email sequentially, which is at the top of page 1, you wrote a few hours later. So we've learned that there are no state issued public assistance photo IDs, though there are some locally issued public assistance photo IDs. You see that?
yes, I do.
Who did you learn that from?
From General Counsel Love.
Do you know how Ms. Love learned that?
I'm not certain. I believe it was either through other litigation that we've had where the AG's office would have that information, or perhaps together with Health and Human Services.
But you don't know for sure.
I believe there was contact with both, but that I just have to leave it with not completely certain as how we confirmed.
When you say that there are no state issued public assistance photo IDs, does that mean that there are no IDs that qualified under Section 10 of H 1169 to be used for voting?
I would simply answer that the law is about photo identification, and that is stated there's an amendment to that section of the law that states photo identification.
Sitting here today, can you name any specific IDs that qualify under Section 10 of H 1169 for use in voting that would not have qualified for use in voting before H 1169 was passed?
At this point in time, I'm not aware of any.
Looking back at this first line in this email, you said, though there are some locally issued public assistance photo IDs, does the state board have a position on whether locally issued public assistance photo IDs qualify as acceptable ID for voting under HB 1169?
We have not made a determination or issued guidance on that.
Would the state board need to make a determination or issue guidance on that question if the injunction were to be lifted?
Yes, I would say we would.
Has anyone from the state board discussed the issue of which public assistance IDs would count under Section 10 of H 1169 with any members of the General Assembly or their staff?
Not that I'm aware of.
What is SEAMS?
That's the State Election Information Management System. That's where those are the modules and the software that we use, the database that we use for voter registration, candidate filing, really the backbone of how we conduct the elections, the records.
Did Section 10 of HB 1169 require any updates or changes to SEAMS?
Section 10, is that what?
Yes, ma'am.
This was the conversation we were having to determine if Section 10 was going to require any updates, and we determined it did not. Not at this time, not at that time. We would need to do that if the injunction were lifted.
And if the injunction were lifted, what would those additional updates or changes to SEAMS entail?
It's actually this very question that I asked, if there would need to be any additional, because of the different criteria of IDs that can be accepted, we have drop-down lists for the poll workers and for the election office workers to process. So this would be an additional drop-down option, for example. So there's a series of steps where that would go into effect.
Since the passage of Section 10 of HB 1169, has the State Board been contacted by any department, agency, or entity of either the U.S. government or the North Carolina government that provides a program of public assistance about the inclusion of their identification cards as approved IDs for voting?
Not that I've been made aware of.
I'd like to turn now to the State Board's efforts to implement SB 824. You understand, as we've been discussing, that SB 824 has been enjoined since December 2019, correct?
Yes.
So is it fair to say that the State Board has not done any work towards implementing SB 824 in 2020 so far?
We have not done any work to implement it. That's correct.
And because of the injunction, the State Board has also not done any work towards implementing Section 10 of HB 1169. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the State Board will continue to not do any work towards implementing those laws unless or until the injunction is lifted. Is that right?
That should be right. Yes, I can't envision a situation where we would.
I want to focus first on the efforts that the State Board undertook towards implementing SB 824 before SB 824 was enjoined. And that's roughly the year between December 2018 and December 2019. Is that right?
That's correct.
If you could turn to the second page, Ms. Bell, this is an affidavit that you submitted in the case North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP v. Cooper in the United States District Court for the Middle District of North Carolina and case number 18-1034. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it was dated October 30th, 2019. Is that right?
Yes.
Could you briefly describe the rulemaking process the State Board undergoes?
There's actually a very nice flow chart about all this, but we have a temporary rule that's put into place. There is also a period of public hearing or public comment so that it can go before the Rules Review Commission. We can adopt a permanent rule. The State Board does that, and then it goes before the Rules Review Commission as well, is my understanding.
How long does that process usually take from start to finish?
I'm trying to recall. It depends on whether you go public hearing or public comment period. I believe the public comment period is 25 days, 20 or 25 days. And then, of course, there's the I believe it's 9 days. I may be getting my dates wrong on the temporary rule to be enacted. And then the Rules Review Commission is subject to their schedule. So that days, the number of days there can vary.
What determines whether you go public hearing, public comment?
I don't recall. We've done public comment, so
Is it in the state board's discretion which you choose?
I don't recall. I actually am not sure I know the answer to that.
You said that the Rules Review Commission piece of it is subject to their own schedule. Do you have a sense, a rough estimate of how long that usually takes in your experience?
What comes to mind seems that it happened within about a month of submitting. So I believe they meet with about that frequency.
And can you explain the difference between temporary and final rules as you understand it?
Well, a temporary rule is specific to a circumstance. The permanent rule is permanently in effect.
Do temporary rules expire?
I believe that's the case, yes.
And permanent rules don't expire unless they're affirmatively repealed.
Correct.
If you look at paragraph 11 of your affidavit, on this page, you describe a temporary rule for the issuance of free voter identification cards by county boards of elections. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then if you turn to paragraph 12, you wrote, the state board is now in the process of updating that rule and making it permanent. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And you wrote that the state board voted to publish this proposed permanent rule for public review and comment on October 18th, 2019, correct?
Yes.
What is the current status of that rule?
It's basically in limbo because of the injunction. It did not go before the Rules Review Commission.
Okay, so it has not yet been enacted.
That's correct.
You wrote the state board has also adopted temporary rules to amend pre-existing rules regarding implementation of the in-person photo ID requirement. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you know the current status of those temporary rules?
I believe these temporary rules are in effect, but but because of the injunction, actually would not be.
And they have not been made permanent. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
And if they expire, then what process, if any, would the state board need to go through to re-up them?
If I understand the process, we would issue a new temporary rule, I believe, and a new expiration date, or we would have to move to permanent rule.
You're familiar with the reasonable impediment provision in SB 824, correct?
Yes.
And under that provision, a county board must accept a reasonable impediment declaration unless the board has grounds to believe the declaration is false. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Has the state board promulgated any regulations explaining how a county board should go about determining whether or not a reasonable impediment declaration is false?
I believe there was some language in the permanent rule that has not gone into effect. And then there is specific to the county board decision process, we had not completed any completed guidance on that when the injunction was put in place.
So that guidance would be guidance for county boards to use to help them understand and make a determination of whether or not a reasonable impediment declaration is false or not. Is that right?
Yes, we issue guidance through numbered memos to county boards for processes such as what you just described.
And that guidance as to falsity of reasonable impediment declarations has not yet been issued.
We have not, correct.
Is it in process or has it not been started yet?
Other than what is referenced in the permanent rule that is in limbo, I don't recall that we got any further than that. So I don't recall us having started a draft of a numbered memo.
But if the injunction were to be lifted, the state board would need to draft that numbered memo before voter ID could be implemented. Is that right?
Yeah, in conjunction with the implementation, at least, yes.
The reasonable impediment declaration will provide certain options for a voter to check off as the reason why they don't have ID. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so some of those reasonable impediments include the inability to obtain photo ID due to lack of transportation. Is that right?
Yes, that is a item on the list.
Okay. And another item is the inability to obtain photo ID due to disability or illness,
Yes,
or that the ID has been lost or stolen.
that's correct.
And there's also an option for quote unquote other, right?
Yes,
And if the voter chooses the quote unquote other option, then the voter is supposed to include a brief written description of the impediment. Is that right?
that's right.
You had previously testified back in June 2019 that your team would need to consider how to administer the other provision. You remember that?
Yes.
Has the state board developed guidance for how to administer the quote unquote other provision?
We were it's essentially in process of dealing with this because that would have been part of poll worker training. It would also be part of the guidance to the boards that I indicated we haven't really begun. So I'd say we're still not complete with that.
Okay, so no formal guidance on the quote unquote other provision has been published or shared with poll workers or county boards of elections. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if the injunction were to be lifted, the state board would need to develop that guidance, correct?
That's right. Or expand upon it. Yes.
I understand that that the guidance hasn't been formalized yet, but I'm just going to go through a few hypotheticals and see if you can help me understand the current state of thinking on the quote unquote other provision. So if a voter chooses not to obtain a free ID because they are scared of COVID and they are choosing to isolate at home, would that count as other?
I think that's an interesting thing for me to consider because when this was in effect and the injunction was put in place, COVID was not part of our consideration. But if I apply the rule of why someone would be able to vote a curbside ballot, for example, the condition that where they feared COVID might impact their condition, they were able to vote curbside. So I think that that's a within reason for circumstance for other in the reasonable impediment.
If a voter wrote that they were taking a principled stand against voter ID because they don't think it's a good policy, would that count as other?
I should probably just say that, other is other, and it's the statement of the voter. And then the rule indicates that it would have to be proven false. So their statement is what's to be considered.
If a voter were to write, the weather is terrible today, would that count as other?
That is an other.
Can you give me an example of anything that would not qualify as other?
We had not defined that there would be anything that would not qualify as other.
But the guidance is not finalized yet. Is that right?
That's correct in terms of, yes.
So is it possible that when the guidance is finalized, there might be a response that would not qualify as other?
Because we haven't actually written beyond just training materials that were in development, I can't say that we would list an item as something not qualifying or that we would not, or that there would be anything that we would state as not qualifying.
You had previously testified back in June 2019 that the state board would be drafting a form for the reasonable impediment declaration that would be available at polling sites. Is that right?
Yes,
And when you were deposed as of June 2019, that form had not been finalized at that point, correct?
that's correct.
Has it been finalized since then?
There was a form that I would say was near final, if not final, that we were planning to be rolling out as part of training and implementation.
It had not yet been rolled out when the law was enjoined.
I don't recall it having been provided to the counties at that point.
Going back to the other question for 1 second, what would happen if a voter left other blank? They checked other, but they didn't write an explanation.
So the decision on any response on the reasonable impediment form is up to the County Board of Elections, and they would have to determine if there was a falsehood to the statement made by the individual and unanimously make a decision on that. So, I mean, that would be to the discretion of the County Boards of Elections to determine unanimously if that's an acceptable answer or not.
In addition to promulgating regulations, the state board is responsible for educating the county boards about SB 24, correct?
Yes.
And also responsible for educating the general public.
That's correct.
Am I right in understanding that those education efforts have stopped since the injunction?
Other than to try to educate the public that there was not, that the injunction had been put in place, yes.
So, as with the regulations, any education or outreach efforts the state board undertook in relation to SB 824, other than informing people of the injunction, took place roughly in the year between December 2018 and December 2019, correct?
That's correct.
And the state board has not undertaken any educational outreach efforts in relation to Section 10 of HB 1169. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is it fair to say that your job became more difficult due to the pandemic?
Yes. That's speculation.
And the state board had to undertake additional responsibilities to prepare for the 2020 election in the pandemic environment, right?
Very much, yes.
So were state board resources diverted from other, typical jobs or typical allotments to dealing with pandemic-related issues?
They were not diverted. It was simply added to our plates.
Going back to the Cooper affidavit, which I think should still be on your screen.
Yes.
If you could go to page 3, which I believe is page 4 in the PDF, and look at paragraph 8. You describe a statewide conference the state board conducted for county board members and staff on July 29th and 30th, 2019, correct?
Yes.
Am I right in presuming that there has been some turnover among county board members and staff since July 2019?
Yes, there has been.
And am I right in my understanding that because of the pandemic, a number of experienced poll workers opted out of the elections in 2020?
That's correct.
So is it fair to say that all current county board members and staff did not attend this 2019 training?
That would be correct. Yes.
If you can flip ahead to paragraph 35, that's page 11 of the affidavit, I think page 12 of the PDF.
You said paragraph 35?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So this again describes that same conference from July 29th and 30th, 2019. Is that right?
That's right.
And you stated in your affidavit that at this conference, you informed conference attendees that a more detailed presentation and training on the implementation of photo ID would take place following municipal elections this year. You see that?
Yes.
Did that training come to pass?
Our training staff had, and our election administration staff had developed the training, but we had not actually conducted the training.
Was there another statewide conference held in 2020?
Held in 2020?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yes, we held a statewide conference. I believe it was the first couple of days of February.
Was voter ID discussed at that conference?
There was not a specific presentation on it. There was some acknowledgement that there was an injunction and that we would not be implementing.
Turning to the next paragraph, paragraph 36, you stated that the state board was in the process of developing training for county boards and their staff. Is that the training that you just mentioned you were developing, or is this different?
That's part of the training, yes.
And that has not yet been rolled out, correct?
That is correct.
So training materials would need to be updated for the county board as that guidance was finalized. Is that correct?
That's correct. Or the guidance itself is the information that they need.
On paragraph 36 still, you wrote, following this training, county boards will have the resources to adequately train their poll workers on the implementation of the photo ID law at the polls, right?
Yes.
So it's your view that training to county boards is critical to enable county boards to train their poll workers?
Yes.
And you stated here that the state board had conducted over 200 public seminars on the photo ID requirement, 2 in each county between June and August 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you know that the state board has conducted any such public seminars after August 2019?
I believe there may have been a few that were done as webinars or something for some community groups. And I believe there was at least one county that had some additional public seminars that they conducted, but it would be a very small number after August 2019.
So the vast majority of counties haven't had a public seminar on photo ID for over a year. Is that fair?
That would be accurate.
This is marked as Exhibit 15. It's rates number Holmes SBOE POD 006780. This spreadsheet is a list of those public seminars we were just discussing. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's what this is. Yes.
And the right-hand column shows the number of attendees at each of those seminars. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And if you look at the first page, at the very bottom of the page, on the right-hand column, it says sum total of the number of attendees for that page. Is that right?
That's right.
So I will save you some math, and I represent to you that across all the pages in this document, that adds up to 3,209 attendees across each of those public seminars. Would you agree that that's not a particularly high number in comparison to the number of North Carolina voters?
That is a small number compared to 7.3 million registered voters. Yes.
Ms. Ballot, if you could please look at paragraph 20. It's on page 7 of the declaration and page 8 of the PDF.
I'm there.
Great. You stated that in September 2019, the state board distributed a mass mailing to every registered voter who the state board determined may not possess a DMV issued ID, correct?
Yes.
And that mailing went to about 700,000 North Carolinians, is that right?
That's right.
Since that September 2019 mailing, has the state board sent any such mass mailing to registered voters who may not possess DMV issued ID?
Well, not for that specific, not because they were identified on that list. We did do a mailing indicating the injunction that would have gone to every household in North Carolina. So that may have meant we reached some of these individuals, but not as a specific mailing because they are identified in this group.
When did the mailing indicating the injunction was in place go out?
That was early January, as I recall.
Can you turn to paragraph 24 on the next page?
Okay.
So you stated between now and when early voting begins for the 2020 general election, each resident will receive 4 notifications of the photo ID requirements for voting. Do you see that?
Yes.
How many of those mailings actually went out before the law was enjoined?
We did not send out those mailings as identified there. We used one of those mailings to do the notification that it had been enjoined.
You wrote about halfway down, in my experience, the poll workers should be trained on the voting requirements they will implement immediately before the forthcoming election. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you still agree with that statement?
Completely.
So is it fair to say that if the injunction was lifted, you would not want to rely solely on the training the state board had done in 2019?
That's correct.
The training that the state board conducted to educate county boards and poll workers on SB 824 was based in part on the training that the state board conducted to educate the county boards about HB 589. Is that right?
State your question again, please.
Was the training that the state board conducted to educate county boards on SB 824 based in any way on training the state board had previously done to educate county boards about HB 589 after HB 589 was enacted?
There were new training materials developed for the outreach for 824.
You're aware that the state board did conduct training on the voter ID requirements for HB 589, correct?
Yes.
Do you know whether after the state board conducted that training on HB 589, the state board conducted any organized post-training evaluation to confirm whether poll workers comprehended the identification requirements?
I don't know that a particular analysis to that. I don't know.
Do you know whether the state board required county boards of election to conduct any post-training evaluation to confirm whether poll workers comprehended the requirements of HB 589?
I don't know.
What is a provisional ballot?
A provisional ballot is often called fail-safe voting option because if an individual presents themselves to vote and is not identified in the poll book, they have the option to vote a provisional ballot so that their registration can be checked or the circumstance for why they were not in the poll book can be verified and determined whether that ballot can be counted.
And am I right in understanding that in the voter ID context, you might vote a provisional ballot if you have an ID, but it's not with you, and you can bring your ID later on and have it counted? Is that right?
Yes.
So do you have an understanding of whether or not poll workers were trained on the appropriate use of provisional ballots after HB 589 was enacted?
Yes, there was training for poll workers after 589, the VIVA bill.
And that training included information on provisional ballots, correct?
That's correct.
After the March 2016 primary election, did the state board undertake any efforts to confirm that county boards had properly instructed voters about their options for voting provisionally if the voter did not present a form of photo ID that's acceptable?
I don't know whether that was done or not.
Do you know whether the state board undertook any efforts to confirm that the decisions in the March 2016 primary election about whether or not to count provisional ballots were correctly made?
I don't know to that specific election or not. We do audit provisional ballots, so, but I don't know if that was done at that point in time.
At the very end, it goes into the next page. You wrote, as of October 21st, 2019, county boards had issued 1,720 voter IDs. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you happen to know what that number is as of today?
I don't know the exact number. I would, but I don't know the exact number. It would be somewhere close to that, I would believe.
Have the county boards continued to provide free IDs since SB 824 was enjoined?
Yeah, we instructed them to not do so.
Under SB 824, free IDs can also be issued by DMVs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you know whether the DMVs have continued to provide free IDs since SB 824 was enjoined?
They have never been told to stop issuing free IDs.
Do you know how many free IDs have been issued by DMVs since December 19th, 2018?
I don't know specifically.
Am I right in saying that DMVs in North Carolina have reduced their open hours significantly during the pandemic?
That is my understanding.
Would it be fair to say that it's more difficult for voters to obtain IDs in general during the pandemic than before?
Since that's not my agency, I don't know if I should say whether it's more difficult or not.
In your personal capacity, not as a state board representative, has it been your experience that basic governmental functions can be more difficult or take longer during the pandemic than they were before the pandemic?
In my personal capacity, I have seen where other agencies are making sure to advise the public to that effect, that they may be delayed in responses or in services.
Do you have any understanding in your personal capacity of whether or not COVID disproportionately affects Black Americans compared to white Americans?
In my personal capacity, I have read news reports indicating that minority groups may be suffering more from the effects of COVID or from COVID cases.
So we're going to go back to your representative capacity for now. We had just discussed a number of items the state board needs to do before voter ID can be implemented, correct?
Yes.
If the injunction were to be lifted, what is your estimate of how long it would take the state board to implement all of these items, including the promulgation of rules, mailings, trainings, all the things we just discussed?
I haven't developed a specific time frame, but I would say we generally try to give if possible, a 6-month window to our SEAM system for any developments or enhancements or testing that needs to be done. So if there's changes, which we do know because of 1169 that there is an item that could be different. We also we would be facing an expiration period on the student, university, college IDs. That would be November 1 of 2021. So I also, we have not conducted the poll worker training. That would have to take place. Of course, that would depend on that. Poll worker training usually happens within 2 to 3 months preceding an election. So that would just depend on the election when it would go into effect. But we would have to make preparatory steps. We also would need to consider other aspects like absentee by mail envelope design. and things of that nature. So I think easily we need 6 months on the state board's end to prepare, and that's without really putting pen to paper to consider the different aspects.
You mentioned in that answer that there's an expiration period on the student university college IDs on November 1st, 2021. Can you explain more what that means?
The approval, the submission for approval is every 2 years, I believe is the way that it has been written. So that took place in 2019. And so the 2-year period would be 2021.
So just to make it more concrete, am I understanding correctly that if, say, Duke University submitted their IDs for approval and they've been approved, then they have to submit them again by November 1st, 2021?
That's correct.
If the injunction were to be lifted, do you have an estimate of how much funding the state board would need to implement all of the items that we've just been discussing the past several minutes? All the trainings and the promulgation of rules, et cetera.
I believe we would need to make a similar request because I think there are aspects that where we would have to make sure that the funds were available to us again if they were unspent because of the mailings and other items that were put on hold. But I think there would have to be a discussion about additional funds to consider services that, if the seminars, for example, would those need to be funded again in order to continue? There were also some staff positions that were specific to photo ID that would not still be funded, so that would be another consideration.
Do you know whether or not there's been a proposed budget for fiscal year 21 to 22 yet?
No, those preparations will begin soon. Jessica, I need to clarify one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I believe I stated that we did not send out any of the mailings to households. I just wanted to clarify. I believe that I stated that none of the 4 mailings that we planned to households in general ever went out. One of those did, I've realized. It was a postcard that was sent shortly after the municipal elections. I believe it went out before Thanksgiving, but none of the others did.
And so one of those 4 went out, but the other 3 did not. Is that right?
That's right.
It's your understanding that SB 824 provides that some university or employer IDs may be used for voting, correct?
That's correct.
And SB 824 imposed certain restrictions on the university or employer IDs that the university had to meet for their IDs to be approved for voting purposes. Is that right?
That's right.
This is marked as exhibit number 17, and it's exhibit P to the affidavit we've been discussing that you submitted in the federal case. And it's also date stamped Holmes SBOE POD 004048. So this is a letter that your predecessor at the state board sent to several members of the General Assembly, correct?
Correct.
In March 2019, correct?
Yes.
And the letter is about the approval of student and employee identification cards under SB 824.
That's correct.
And this letter was sent on the date that was the original deadline for the state board to approve student and employee IDs for use as a voter ID. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you turn with me to the second paragraph? It says, of the approximately 850 universities, colleges, state and local employers, including charter schools and tribal entities that were eligible to have their identification cards approved, 81 institutions submitted requests to the State Board of Elections. Do you see that?
I do.
So that's a little bit less than 10%. Is that right?
That would be about right. Yes.
And Ms. Strack noted that the state board does not in all cases know why the majority of institutions chose not to request approval, but in some cases, institutions raised concerns they believe they could not meet the current statutory requirements. Do you see that?
I do.
And she wrote, others requested additional time to submit their requests. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you know whether any colleges or universities have informed the state board that they found the process for obtaining approval for their IDs to be used for voting to be a burdensome process?
I believe that is that in here? I believe that's in here. I'm not sure if they've stated that specifically. I don't see that specifically stated in this document.
Taylor, could you please mark the November 26, 2019 press release? Thank you. So this is Exhibit 18, and it is a press release from the State Board of Elections dated November 26, 2019. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And it states that as of that date, more than 150 types of photo ID are approved for use in voting, correct?
That's correct.
And that's not limited just to school and employer IDs, right? That number also includes driver's licenses and passports and other forms of ID.
That's correct.
So fewer than 150 schools or employers had approved IDs as of November 2019. Is that right?
State your question one more time. I'm sorry.
As of the date of this press release, fewer than 150 schools or employers had their IDs approved for voting. Is that right?
I believe that's right. I mean, there were more than 150 at this point approved, but I don't know that all 150 would not have been student IDs.
Are you aware of any additional schools or employers whose IDs were approved after November 26, 2019?
Yes, we were able to look at some after December 21st or after December 1st, I believe, and approved a few more.
Do you know how many that was?
20 comes to mind, but I might be wrong on that.
Am I right that beginning on January 1st, 2021, school and employee IDs must have an expiration date to be acceptable for voting?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Am I right that certain IDs that were approved in 2019 for elections in 2019 and 2020 did not contain an expiration date?
That's correct. That's my understanding.
So do you anticipate that the expiration date requirement that begins on January 1st will lower the number of schools or employers that are able to gain approval of their IDs to be used in 2021 and 2022?
That would just depend on whether they've implemented that or not.
What is an electronic poll book?
An electronic poll book is a computer that is used at a polling place to check in, and that an operator uses to look up a voter when they check in, and from that we print in our case we call it the authorization to vote form, which is a substitute to more traditional ledger style poll books.
Is a ledger style a printed version?
Well, a true ledger style would take you back to what looks like a ledger book with lines and printed names and signatures, but we moved beyond that to a label system and printed authorization to vote forms, so that we do not use ledgers any longer. A county would use a label system poll book with the authorization to vote forms, or they would use the electronic poll book format.
And is it the county's decision whether they use the label form or the electronic poll book?
Yes, it is.
Do you know what EVID is? Do you say EVID?
We refer to it as EVID.
EVID, okay, thank you. What is EVID?
EVID, and I'm not sure what their initials stand for off the top of my head, but it is a product by VR Systems that is an electronic poll book by that company that is used by some counties in North Carolina.
Taylor, could you please pull up tab 29? This is a document date stamped Holmes SBOE POD 070875, marked as Exhibit 19. Do you see it, Ms. Bell?
I do.
This is an email to you dated February 3rd, 2020, correct?
That's correct.
And it lists out the counties intending to use EVID in the upcoming elections. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you know if the counties on this list, in fact, did use EVID for the general elections in November 2020?
That's my recollection. I don't recall whether Edgecombe went forward with it or not.
I want to direct your attention to Mecklenburg County in particular. Do you happen to know when Mecklenburg County first implemented EVID?
I don't know a specific date. They have used it for many years.
Do you know whether Mecklenburg County used EVID for Election Day voter check-in during the 2016 general election?
I don't know specifically. I would hate to misstate. I believe they did, but I'd hate to misstate.
And when you said you think they've used it for many years, did you have a ballpark in mind of how many years you think they've been using it?
My recollection of counties first using EVID would have been, I believe there was a system in place, a version of EVID around the 2010 timeframe, perhaps. I don't recall what I would not have worked directly with Mecklenburg County at that point in time to know whether they adopted it then, but that would be about the timeframe that I recall EVID first being used in North Carolina.
I just wanted to turn back quickly what we were discussing right before the lunch break, Ms. Bell. We were talking about EVID, right?
That's correct.
Just to confirm, you don't know for sure whether or not Mecklenburg County used EVID for the 2016 general election. Is that right?
I'm not certain. I believe that was the case, but I'm not certain.
You're not certain?
Correct.
You don't know for sure either way?
I believe that is correct, but I'm not 100% certain.
3-2. Are you familiar with this document, Ms. Bell?
I am, yes.
Oh, what is the document?
Oh, you cut out on me. Okay. So as it's titled, the post-election audit report that was from the 2016 general election dated April 21st, 2017.
And what is a post-election audit report?
This particular report, there's a variety of post-election audits, but this particular report was done by the agency. It's detailed in other parts of the document. It was to look for irregularities that the investigators wanted to review with the voter and election records and database for irregularities and ineligible voters who may have voted.
Can you turn with me to page 2 of the report, which I believe is page 3 of the PDF?
The summary page?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And this page summarizes the findings of this audit, right?
That's correct.
So looking at the very top, it says that nearly 4.8 million North Carolina voters participated in the 2016 general election, correct?
That's right.
Let's look at the first bullet. It states there are 441 open cases of voting by suspected active felons. Is that right?
That's what it states, yes.
What does that mean?
So in this case, they have identified they were able to, let me restate that. In this case, they are individuals who could be current felons and may have voted during the 2016 general election.
And if these individuals were in fact current felons, they should not have been eligible to vote. Is that right?
That's correct.
And voter ID doesn't address the issue of felons voting, does it?
Not specifically, no.
Does it address it generally?
Not in particular, no.
Let's look at the second bullet. It states that 41 non-citizens with legal status, green card, etc., cast ballots. Do you see that?
Yes,
And non-citizens are not eligible to vote, correct?
that is correct.
Non-citizens are sometimes able to obtain student IDs from schools they attend, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And certain approved student IDs can be used to vote, correct?
That's correct.
Let's turn to the third bullet. It states that there are 24 substantiated cases of double voting initiated through tips and data audits, correct?
Yes,
And is double voting when one person votes twice?
that's correct.
And voter ID doesn't address issues of double voting, does it?
Not specifically, no.
Does it address it at all?
It would be more to the next point of a voter impersonation that's a double vote.
How so?
Typical double voting is when someone would vote absentee by mail, and before we could process that, they would go and vote in person. So it would have to be a way to confirm that individual voted in both cases, and we would realize that potentially in that small gap between the two instances. But our system generally would catch that just by our check-in process and so forth. The situation of the voter impersonation, it could be that if someone presents themselves twice, that would be a less likely scenario.
So as you mentioned, there were 2 cases of voter impersonation, right?
That's correct.
And as you were saying, it's conceivable that voter ID, had it been in place, might have prevented those 2 instances of voter impersonation. Is that right?
Possibly, because if you notice in one, there's a situation where someone presented themselves as a deceased loved one, and unless they specifically look just like their deceased loved one, it could have possibly prevented it in this case.
And if you turn to, I think, page 6 of this report, just page 7 of the PDF, and you go down the third paragraph, it explains further those specific instances of voter impersonation, as you were just saying, right?
That's correct.
So as you mentioned, in one of those instances, a widow voted by mail after allegedly forging her husband's signature, right?
That's right.
And the other instance, a daughter allegedly presented in person in the name of her deceased mother, correct?
Correct.
So it's the second instance that you were discussing where the daughter allegedly presented in person. It's unlikely, that it is likely voter ID might possibly have made a difference there unless the daughter happened to look just like the mother.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So out of the 508 open voter fraud cases in the 2016 general election, voter ID would have been likely to make a real difference in maybe 1 or 2 of those cases. Is that right?
Yes, I think it would be. We identified that most likely voter impersonation is where photo ID would have the most impact.
And there were 2 cases of voter impersonation out of 4.8 million votes cast in the 2016 general election. Is that right?
That's what this report found, yes.
You don't have any
Williams,
reports.
can you pause that for a second?
Yes, Your Honor.
Um, I'm just curious how much longer this deposition has.
Your Honor, we have approximately 30 minutes left of the video.
Okay. Probably a good time to go ahead and then stop that. And let me just inquire, are there any exhibits that need to be introduced in this short period of time between now and 5 o'clock? Or are there any other matters that we need to take up prior to recess for the day?
Your Honor, this is Allison Riggs on behalf of the plaintiffs. I don't think we need to deal with exhibits just now, but I did want to raise to the court's attention. We've been made aware, been notified by legislative defendants that Mr. Ford is not available again until Friday morning. So we anticipate being unable to rest our case in chief and needing to take witnesses out of order because Mr. Ford's, the finishing of his testimony and the rest of this video represents the rest of plaintiff's case in chief.
Okay. Mr. Thompson, do you want to be heard on that?
Your Honor, I would just say that we would propose to have Professor Callanan start tomorrow and make as soon as this deposition is complete. And then we're willing to break off from him or the next expert witness so that Mr. Ford can finish off his testimony first thing Friday morning, if that would be acceptable to the court.
Mr. Cox, do you wish to be heard?
Your Honor.
All right, so I'm taking it then, just let me sort of restate this to make sure that everyone's on the same page here. What we're going to do is basically suspend the plaintiff's case in chief and allow you to present a witness in the meantime. But as far as record purposes go, it would be just as if the plaintiff had finished with Mr. Ford, finished all their evidence, rested, heard motions at the close of the plaintiff's evidence, and then you started with Professor Callanan. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
Your Honor, exactly right.
So there'd be no prejudice to the plaintiffs by allowing you to present your evidence, and then we wouldn't lose a day of court time, right?
Correct.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. I mean, I'm not sure we anticipate motions at the close of evidence. If we do, obviously, I think that does present some prejudice to us, but assuming we don't anticipate such motions being made, plaintiffs understand the reality of working with schedules and would just note that I think for the record, we would suspend our case, but it wouldn't be rested until Mr. Ford finished his testimony.
I think that's what I tried to say is that you're suspending your testimony, but there's no prejudice to you doing so, and you're actually not resting until the finish of Mr. Ford's testimony. Now, I don't guess I'll comment on whether or not defendants can make any motions at the close of the plaintiff's evidence, but I think under the rules, we certainly have that right. What I'm saying to you is that there would be no prejudice to you for that delay, notwithstanding any defendant's motions at the close of the plaintiff's evidence. The fact that you're not, I guess what I'm trying to say is the fact that you're not anticipating motions, I don't know what to tell you there. I mean, they're entitled to make motions under the rules, and so I'm not going to necessarily prevent them from doing that.
Right. I guess, Your Honor, they can make whatever motions they want after we rest our case. So on Friday, not tomorrow.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yes, that's
then
what
then we are on accord.
Right. Okay. Sounds like we're all on the same page then. So Mr. Thompson, you can have your first witness then ready tomorrow morning. Looks like we got about 30 minutes of Karen Bell's deposition to go, and then maybe some introduction of exhibits, but we won't hold you to that, Ms. Riggs. You can do that after Ford's testimony also. And I know Mr. Brockman said earlier that he did have some exhibits, but he would wait till the end of Joel Ford's testimony to introduce those. So, okay, I think we're all good there. Anything else then before we recess for the day?
Nothing for the legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Nothing for plaintiffs, Your Honor.
Let me just ask this, and so, and this may be premature, Mr. Thompson, but just kind of for planning purposes, looks like we see the light at the end of the tunnel for plaintiff's case. What does the defendant's case sort of look like? And as far as times, understanding that I'm not going to hold you to this, I'm just trying to get sort of a general idea. Obviously, it looks like we'll be going in the next week. Just trying to figure out sort of what your ballpark is as to the number of days your evidence would take.
Your Honor, I would respectfully ask that maybe I can give you a more thoughtful answer tomorrow at the opening. But, you know, we basically anticipate having streamlined directs and submitting the expert reports as a direct. And then it's really largely going to be dependent on the length of the cross-examinations.
That's fine. I didn't mean to pin you down. I just
Yeah.
thought, well, we're looking at another 2 weeks, or
No,
are we looking at another?
No, Your Honor, we're very confident that this will be done next week.
Okay, that's just kind of what I was at. Mr. Cox, do you have any estimate as to the number of witnesses you would call or the length of your evidence, understanding that I'm not holding you to that?
No, Your Honor. I think once the legislative defendants have put on their witnesses, we anticipate that anything that would be left would be the plaintiff's rebuttal.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. All right, well, thank you for that. And again, I won't hold you to any of that. I just kind of wanted to get sort of a picture in my mind as to, are we halfway through the trial? Are we maybe 2/3 of the way through? And it sounds like we're maybe more closer to 2/3 of the way through than we are halfway. So that's good news. So anything else then before we recess today?
Nothing, Your Honor. Thank you for your time.
All right. We'll be in recess until 9:30 a.m. Tomorrow morning. Hope you all have a good evening. We'll see you then.
Thank you very much.